Welcome back to the second season of the DDI podcast. I'm your host, Mark Yeeles, the Vice President for Schneider Electric's Secure Power Division here in the UK and Ireland. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by David Hall, SVP of Co-Location at Atlas Edge, into this, what can only be described as the hot seat. With more than 20 years experience in the data center industry, David has worked extensively in the US, Australia, and in Europe. And prior to honing his craft within the co-location sector, he studied machine learning at Edinburgh University, where he discovered a love for fine whiskey as well as AI. So today we're going to be dancing on the edge and exploring the idea of data centers as good corporate citizens and asking, how do we build a truly sustainable internet?
Thank you for the intro.
Well, thanks for joining us on the second season, of course. Let's get straight into this then. So maybe a quick background intro. I wonder if you can help our listeners understand a little bit more about Atlas Edge and maybe your personal journey into tech. How did you land in data centers after studying machine learning?
Sure. So I guess Atlas Edge evolved to solve for a use case. And that use case is with the next generation of, I guess, the internet, but some of the applications that we're hosting on the internet, things like machine learning applications, some of the kind of latest comms technologies really require data centers to be much closer to the users that they're serving. So, historically, particularly in Europe, we've seen kind of consolidation in a fairly small number of markets, which serve the vast majority of Europe. But that's really not going to suit the kind of next generation of internet applications. And it also doesn't provide the levels of security and robustness that the internet was originally designed for. So Atlas Edge mission really was to take everything we all learned working in the carrier neutral industry for 20 years and apply it to this problem of how and where do we build the edge, and really how do we build an internet which is suitable for the next generation, or the infrastructure that's suitable to support the internet that's going to provide the next generation of kind of applications and services. As for my own potted journey, so like many people in data centers, it wasn't exactly where I expected to end it up. I'd finished my master's degree and in Edinburgh, where I discovered the whiskey, but I also discovered that I wasn't a huge fan of the cold. So it seemed eminently sensible to move to Australia, where it definitely wasn't cold, but the whiskey was not as good. And so I moved to Australia, rapidly needed a job. And the first job was a job in data centers. And there we go, 21 years later, and I'm still working in this fantastic sector.
Wow. Amazing how you made that sacrifice, really, of the single malt whiskey. So fascinating story. So data centers must have been a stronger pull. I don't think I've ever heard that said before, but hey, so you recently coined the phrase dancing on the edge, and you've spoken about your journey and new ideas, and maybe encourage others to pursue opportunities around digital infrastructure and sustainability. Could you explain to us and maybe tell us a little bit more about your learnings, and really, what do you mean by dancing on the edge?
So look, I think we're at one of those points of inflection. So I think really, if you look at the data center industry, right, I really see this as the kind of third era of the industry. Era number one was kind of era of machine rooms supporting the early ARPANET, kind of 1982, you've got TCP/IP. Actually, fundamentally, data centers served as the kind of minimum viable product that would support that internet. And then I think you saw, as the modern internet developed in the kind of 2000s, you saw a class of fit for purpose for the internet of the 2000s kind of style. So these were still relatively low density, probably not particularly efficient, PUEs kind of above 2, certainly not really acting as good neighbors from a kind of corporate citizen perspective, and clustered into a fairly small number of places, some of which don't really want those data centers anymore. I think about the kind of Amsterdams and the Dublins of the world, right? And so here we are in the third era of data centers. And that third era, I think, is super exciting. I think it's super exciting for me, first of all, because of the things we're going to do there, right? So no one builds data centers just because data centers are pretty buildings. We build data centers to solve for some kind of use case. And the use cases that we're solving for now and the use cases that we're talking to customers about hosting are really transformational, right? These machine learning platforms are going to completely change how the world works. So I think that there's an excitement, and certainly I see that at Atlas Edge. There's a really profound level of excitement and enthusiasm that comes from people knowing that they're doing something which is really going to change the world. And then associated with that, and I think the kind of really lovely consequence of doing stuff at the edge, because these sites are a bit more smaller, they're much closer to other people, we're building them in city centres, basically. The opportunity for us to do things that's harder to do when you're building a site in the middle of nowhere is just that much greater. So all of the things that I know we and Schneider have been talking about for years, but probably haven't actually seen at scale, things like heat recovery and reuse, things like building grid interactive UPSs and tying the UPS into the distribution grid fabric, really being a good corporate citizen, not just providing kind of data. I think that that's the really exciting thing. So you kind of combine all those things together. I think I was a little bit inspired by my sheepdog, who, when she gets super excited when we get home, does a little crazy dance. But that, somewhere between that and walking into the office and seeing all these kind of happy people working away at this problem, it seemed like really the best thing that we could do is dance, right? So there you go. That's where we got dancing from the edge. So that's what we've learned, I guess, is that we can build these incredibly sustainable, really efficient data centers. We can do them in a way that's much, much friendlier to the local populations and is going to support communities benefit from really rich machine learning and other tools that just wouldn't be able to exist without them.
Oh, fascinating story. I love the enthusiasm around, because I think what you're talking about there is phase 3.5, 4. You're almost moving into that phase and accelerating us in there already. And on a personal note, I know you and I have had some discussions prior to this talking about sustainability and how do we affect the overall ecosystem. You kind of touched on it a little bit there. And personally, I love this idea of building a sustainable internet, which ultimately means sustainable DCs. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit further on what you believe are kind of like the 4 pillars we need to create that sustainable internet? That really interests me.
That's a great question. So essentially that from what we do in a data center, right? We're taking a whole bunch of power and we're turning it into heat and data. And for a long time as an industry, we've measured ourselves in terms of how efficiently we can transport that heat into the sky or into the oceans. And clearly that's just not really sustainable. Even if I'm getting power from renewables, there isn't enough renewable generation globally. So if I'm powering my data center from renewables, I'm probably just displacing someone else into dirty coal. And you know what? The atmosphere just doesn't care, right? I'm not going to be able to go to the beach and say, well, sea level shouldn't rise for me because my data center's using renewable power, right? So it just doesn't work like that. So we really need to be more sophisticated in terms of where we're putting data centers. And by that, I mean, we should be thinking about locations where we can participate positively in grid services. So whether or not, for example, that's locating a data center near a big solar project and then installing a load of batteries. And, often big solar projects, you have this challenge where peak generation is at midday, but people are at work at midday in their nice, efficiently air-conditioned offices. They come home from work at 4:00 in the afternoon and turn their inefficient home AC on. And this is certainly a problem in countries like Spain and Portugal where we have operations. If you could just store that energy for 4 hours, which you can actually do, essentially UPS gives you all the tools that you need to be able to do that. You can do that and actually be a really good corporate citizen because you're essentially enabling that solar grid to exist or at least to be profitable. And then also, when you then think about the heat piece of this, right? There's tons of industries that need low grade heat, whether it's, a hotel that's going to have to take its cold water, warm it up through a boiler and then use it for washing, whether it's hospitals, there's a whole raft of different organizations who want heat. And of course, providing heat is great because it actually means that if I'm providing heat to a hotel, they turn their boiler off. So actually, we're not now in a position where adding data center, even if it's using green energy, is actually just additional energy required. In this instance, we're netting out energy required somewhere else. So we're displacing someone else's load. So I think that these data centers that are more thoughtfully positioned to be able to support both the grids and for heat recovery and reuse are super, super important. Doing that at a level that you can support the kind of performance and cost objectives, ultimately, we still want data centers to be secure, right? We still want data centers to be able to manage our private data efficiently. We still want them to be online. It's really, availability is so critical, right? Actually, if you look at the total carbon required to build a data center, it pales into insignificance with the total carbon required to fill up the racks with servers and expensive CPUs, right? And so given that I'm going to be building CPUs, I want those CPUs to be running all the time as efficiently as possible, right? Because that's actually where the major carbon impact is. So I think, it's the totality of these things, making sure that the IT is running as efficiently as possible, but then choosing a place to build the data center where you can do things that make you a better corporate citizen. That's where we find ourselves on our journey to build a sustainable internet.
I think this is fascinating. And you touched on it on the last point there, which is that's now drifting into the operational phase, what you spoke about there. So how do you make them most effective? And I saw a quote the other day from our zone president saying the most cost-efficient energy usage is the energy you don't use. So if we can become more effective in that space and more optimized, imagine what we could do then. Could be quite staggering.
The same with buildings as well, Mark. I mean, the vast majority of the buildings that Atlas Edge currently operate were existing physical buildings that we've converted or installed data center in. Look, sometimes that's just not possible. But for me, if there's an old paper mill or an old warehouse or something like that, it probably doesn't need me to knock it down and build a new building. So, we're really being quite thoughtful around the architecture of an Atlas Edge site that says, sometimes we're going to come along and there's just going to be a field there and we're going to need to build something. And then when we are building something, we want to build that as efficiently as possible, right? So that, for example, might involve elements of modular offsite construction, doing as little as possible physically there, making sure that all of the really high tech stuff we're doing in a factory like one of yours, assembling skids of equipment, minimizing the number of transport moves from the factory, but also minimizing, it's much, much more efficient for us to have 100 engineers in a Schneider factory building us an energy plant, right? Than it is for us to be assembling that on site, because we can work with you to test it. All of that can be done. It can be lovingly wrapped up, delivered to site and installed. And that's really super efficient in terms of the build times, but really efficient in terms of the build CO2 as well. So I think that looking at those elements of modular construction as well is super efficient way of building efficiently. And that's really where you kind of find this intersection of location, those kind of technologies that you support. And, I think it's great that vendors like Schneider, actively marketing technologies from liquid cooling, from these grid interactive UPSs that enable us to actually participate much more effectively in these, new world of data center. We call it actually internally, we call it an energy center. So there's this data center piece, which is doing its data center piece. And then there's this energy center piece, which hopefully is going to be providing hot water to our neighbors and storing energy when there's an excess available on the grid and releasing it into the grid when there's demand.
Well, I think you've touched on something there, which is around tech and innovation. Maybe we can pick that up at another time. But I think one of the things that I've been pretty, vociferous about more recently is data centers as good corporate citizens. And I do believe our industry is ahead of some, maybe slightly behind on others. And you've spoken there about district heating schemes. You've spoken about generating renewables, synchronization with the grid. But when you think about the broader society, where else are you seeing opportunities for Atlas Edge in this? And how can you create that infrastructure that benefits the broader piece? Expand out rather than be honed in on just the data center industry.
It is really important for us when we're building something. I think the industry for a long time kind of sold these data centers as these sort of high-tech palaces that are going to create thousands of high-tech jobs. And whether any of us really believe that or not, the reality is that, there's a whole bunch of jobs during construction, but there's fairly few. Most of us staff our data centers quite lightly post-construction. So I think during the construction process, going to be a little bit annoying, right? There's going to be trucks, there's going to be noise, and we do everything we can to really minimize that and actually engage positively with the community prior to doing that. The modular offsite construction helps a lot because a lot of the dirtier works we're able to do offsite. And then being thoughtful around the design, right? Making sure that we're incorporating green spaces, making sure that we're incorporating biodiverse planting, beehives, all of those good things. But that's fairly minimal, frankly, all of that stuff. I think actually apart from things like providing heat to district heating systems and stuff, which is a clear benefit, I think one of the important things that we need to do as an industry is to explain the kind of secondary benefits through the existence of data centers, right? So when one of our neighbors is being treated at their local hospital, and, they're getting an MRI scan, it's very likely that in the future, that MRI scan is going to be processed by a computer. And that's incredible, right? A consultant might see 1,000 patients in their professional career, right? A computer can learn from 1,000,000 patients' MRI scans. And we're really at that point where computers with human assistance, right, are going to be better than your average human at analyzing those scans. So I think for an industry, it's really important for us to be able to explain to our neighbours that actually, whilst they don't necessarily benefit from walking up to our front door and being able to kind of interact with us, that we are enabling these secondary benefits that really will help them. Other things like traffic management. Traffic management is becoming a big one. So dynamically modifying speeds and closing and automatically opening roads and lanes and stuff. That's really powerful. That has the power to really dramatically alter traffic flows. And again, that's the kind of thing that's enabled by these local data centers that's going to benefit our neighbours and actually benefit air pollution and all those other good things as well. So I think we still need to be mindful of talking, data centers don't exist in isolation. Right? No one builds a data center that doesn't do something or communicate with the rest of the world, right? And a lot of those things that we do are perhaps more profound than storing cat videos.
The famous cat video.
As profoundly important as cat videos are.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably in the top 10 for some people. I would also add the list of those, and can I call them scope 3 things that the data centers kind of solve when I think about it in sustainability terms? They are endless. You're right. There's healthcare. There's actually machine learning, your initial trade in manufacturing. There's all those things around banking, finance. The world stops if not. Perhaps there's a bit more education to be done on this. And part of the reason for building this podcast series was to help and try and demystify some of those areas for folk. Because I think one of the things that I've learned as we've gone through this series is how to make it so easy for people to understand exactly what would and what wouldn't happen if data centers were or weren't there.
No, I think that's great. I think it's certainly important for people to know more about what we do and us to be more open about what we do, not least because, and perhaps you'll come to it, one of the big challenges facing the industry is recruitment. So I fell into the industry, but it seems that there are not thousands of graduates lining up to go and work in data centers. And I think that's a real shame, because I think it's a really interesting industry with some great opportunities. I think a lot of younger people perhaps have been put off by some of the kind of bad news about in terms of the environmental messages coming out of the industry and some of the kind of fairly negative press that we've had as an industry, and so in fact some of the regulatory pressure as well. But I guess the challenge I would say is actually what we're really looking for is people to help solve that, because we get that, right? We get that we have to be better. And so I really hope that if nothing else, someone thinks, actually I do want to be part of the solution. I get that data centers provide all these good things. How can I work in an industry which actually is going to do something really positive? And, one of the huge challenges in deploying renewables is storage. And data centers seem to be the vehicle where you can make the economics of energy storage work. And data centers produce heat, and people want heat. So actually, we're not far off a world, I don't think, where, we'll look back in 15 years and every data center will recover all of its heat. And we won't call it waste heat, because what we'll call it is a useful product, just like the data that we produce and the electrons and the photons that we send out of fiber are useful products. The other useful product will be heat. And people will look back and wonder how we ever convinced ourselves that PUE was a good way of measuring efficiency. And I really hope that some people are enthused about that and want to participate as the industry evolves. And the industry is evolving, right? Frankly, we've talked about it with vendors like Schneider, and just the interest from the end user perspective has just not been there. And I think, a function of that perhaps has been energy costs have been too low. But in the new world that we live in with high energy costs, suddenly a lot of these things really start to make sense. So I think it's an exciting time for younger folks who perhaps have not had a positive view of us as a sort of really green, sustainable industry to participate and help us be greener.
I really like that. Because being a solving agent, and this is what folk within my team and the broader team at Schneider Electric, often when we talk about, well, we have a problem, well, become a solving agent for it. And I believe, having spoken to a number of early talents, or even those at school age or going through the graduate or apprentice system, they're very passionate about making a difference. That's one of the hot things for them to get done. And they want satisfaction, reward, joy from solving something or making the world a better place to live in.
Absolutely. And there's some really, I've talked a bit about machine learning as an application that we can host, but it's actually also a tool that we can use really effectively as well. So, you look at kind of a traditional building management system, it's very far away from a high-tech machine learning platform, right? Some of these kind of two-wire interfaces and some of this legacy stuff that exists in data centers and the controls that we operate data centers in, we tend to do things not far off the technology that sent man to the moon. And it's really reliable, but it's certainly not engineered for cost, and it's not necessarily engineered for efficiency. Now, we've been looking at opportunities to use machine learning in terms of our controls. I think people have been using ML tools to optimize cooling for a long time, but they probably haven't actively been managing the data center with those tools. Now, I certainly see a world where in 3 or 4 years' time, we're starting to transition from machine learning as a recommendation engine, but as fundamentally the machine is going to tell the human, hey, do this or do this, and the human's going to make some change or not, to machine learning as a tool which is physically operating the data center and, really making very fine adjustments all the time in a way that humans couldn't do. So I think that that's a really exciting and it's a kind of a bit of a circular thing, right? We're hosting these platforms, so we really ought to be using these same platforms to improve our business. So that's one area. I think another area that we've done a lot of work on, and I think we'll certainly have tools that are based on machine learning that do this, is the kind of impact assessment tools, right? So for a company like us, if the HV fails and the Jenny doesn't start, which customers are going to be affected by that? What are the consequences of that impact? Are they going to lose both feeds to the rack? Are they going to just lose resilience? Are the lights going to go off? And being able to do those kind of complex analysis of what's going to happen, what's the impact going to look like, and do that in real time and give customers visibility, within seconds about a potential impact is super exciting. Because I in my experience, normally the lights go out first, and then you've got people running around trying to work out what happened and who to contact. And it's not always particularly graceful. We certainly haven't ever automated it. So I think that's another area where we'll bring in automation this year. And that's really going to be positive for customers, because many of our customers, in a scenario like that, they can swing services to another data center. So the end user is not affected at all. The era of machine learning for data centers is not just that we're going to be hosting more machine learning platforms. It's going to be that we're using machine learning to make our hosting platform better.
Well, and I think what you're highlighting there is, I know we kind of like went into the topic and then out of the topic again, but what you're highlighting is the different kind of skills, thinking, creativity needed to help this be actually a reality and not just, not on a PowerPoint.
Software is something we talk about all the time, right? And it applies to the kind of modular design where we have essentially components that are fungible. We can be talking to you guys, Mark. We can have you design an energy block for us with a transformer, UPS, batteries and stuff. We have a defined size. We have defined interfaces. We know what voltage going in is and the voltage coming out. And then if in 6 months' time you say, hey, David, we've been doing some work with the team. We've really found a way of optimizing this. Why don't you start replacing the Gen 1 Schneider power cells with the Gen 2? Well, we can just immediately incorporate those into the next generation of sites. We're not having to completely redesign the site around that. So that's really something we learned from software. That's very much like how you make software work. You compartmentalize particular functions and you make them fungible. But so data centers design like software, but then data centers that really run code and are very much dependent, not just on a kind of passive BMS that tells you what's wrong, but an active AI BMS that's going to help tell you what goes wrong if something goes wrong, B, going to predict when things go wrong and kind of give you warning and let you plan your maintenance around things that you might otherwise have expected, and C, actually operate the site and, to operate the site in a very dynamic way to maintain performance. So those are probably not the kind of skills that folks might necessarily have thought would be super handy in data centers. But I think increasingly so, we see teams of Mac-Eng, Elec-Eng, and software guys sitting down with each other and designing data centers. So I think that's, as you said, it's kind of it's certainly a broader group of folks than you might have expected are working on these problems.
Yeah, fascinating. And when you think about, it's one of the things I've been trying to solve for on not just this podcast, but in maybe some of the panels, like we're going to start with Data Center World in March, just talking about talent, early talent. We've got a PR job to do. What advice would you offer anyone who was looking to pursue a career in this sector? What would be your kind of top 3 things you'd say to them?
And look, I mean, so there is a level of knowledge and skill that we're looking for, right? So if you're a mech eng or a lec eng, or you've got some software engineering background, that's going to put you in a good place to at least have a conversation. I think my advice would be the industry really has evolved. It perhaps was guilty of being a little bit stale, male and pale and very construction industry focused. As there's been evolution from folks like Google and Microsoft who are really pushing the boundaries of data center design, I would say that the groups that constitute folks who are building data centers, I mean, certainly if I look at our senior leadership team, we're 50% female, there's a whole bunch of diversity. So it's not what you'd expect, I think. So I think don't expect that this is a particularly male-dominated industry anymore. It's certainly not. I think we're all very much focused on finding the right people, different kinds of people. And so I'd encourage anyone that thought this might be interesting to apply, because I think you'll be surprised when you walk through the door for the interview that it's a much more diverse and creative environment perhaps than you expect. And then I'd say it's fun. I started in this as a 21-year-old. I think I traveled to really every corner of the world, some insane number, like 185 countries or something. I've met some incredible people, vendors like you guys at Schneider. We have frequent and really fascinating opportunities to sit down with you, understand the problems that you're working on and share some of the challenges that we have. And, we work with some of the world's best engineers, and then on the customer side as well, we're working with all of the hyperscale platforms that everyone's ever heard of, and they have some really interesting problems. And some of those problems are problems that we can help them solve. So I think as an opportunity to do difficult things and interesting things, the data center industry is really there, and it's really different. Certainly very different from the industry I joined 20 years ago.
What a place to nearly finish on, just talking about how, your career, how it's moved along. 180 countries is quite something, but that's some pinboard. And thanks for the advice for those that are thinking about coming into it as well, because I think you're right. There's electrical, there's software, there's mechanical. I'm also a big believer that STEM is a great place to start, but actually the new concept with STEAM, and just thinking about the arts in there as well, helps some creative people think massively different to maybe what the likes of you and I might do with a certain education and background and either a graduate or an apprenticeship scheme. But let me come to the last point here. And I think, you've touched on this, giving us a bit of a future gazing. But in your opinion, what's the next disruptive force in tech? And how do you think it might affect, people in general and then your business?
Machine learning is going to be profoundly disruptive. Machine learning has been around for a long time. So I was studying machine learning at university, but there were a couple of challenges with the kind of machine learning that we were studying back then. And first was that there wasn't really computers that could enable you to operate these kind of very parallel, these neural networks essentially in a very efficient way. So even if you could make them work, they worked very slowly. And secondly, training. So if you wanted to teach a neural network of 10 years ago to recognize cats, you'd basically get a load of people in an office building to take pictures from the internet and draw an outline around all the cats, right? And then you'd feed the computer all these pre-labeled images of cats with outlines around them, and it would learn this is a cat. So what's happened that makes, it doesn't really matter whether it's a large language model or some other thing, but the transformational step is that these models now do self-guided learning. So you don't need to label cats. You can just say, go wild. Here's an example of a cat, but go find other examples of a cat, and it will go find other examples of a cat. And in doing so, it becomes better and better at finding examples of cats, right? So this is really a transformational leap, and it's not clear that there's much more that you need to do to get to a level of general intelligence. It's a debate that cognitive scientists and machine learning people have, and it probably is longer than we have left to discuss, Mark. But it's not obvious that there's a fundamental technological leap required before we have a general purpose AI. And that's kind of scary and terrifying and wonderful at the same time. It certainly requires us to be thoughtful around what we do with it. But it's going to have massive impacts, in the same way that the printing press had massive impacts. People that wrote books were suddenly out of work, but the cost of books went down so everyone else could learn. I think that we will find that many jobs are affected by it, and governments will have to find ways of supporting those people that no longer have, these are relatively skilled jobs like lawyers and stuff, right? That you just won't need because computers will be able to do it better. So I think that's the kind of, I guess from a technology perspective, that's probably where my head's at. From a data center perspective, my personal area that I'm determined to do something about is we still build data centers for computers and people. We need to keep the air at the right temperature so people are in, we leave oxygen in the air because people don't like it when there's no oxygen in the air. But actually, we could have different temperatures and different velocities and no oxygen to remove the risk of fires and stuff. And that would be a perfectly good environment for a computer. And you're starting to see this with things like immersion cooling, right? Which are environments that are not designed for humans, but are designed for computers. So I think that trend's going to continue. I don't know whether it will all be immersion, but I certainly foresee in the future warehouses that might look much more like an Amazon warehouse where, there's robots wandering around. A lot of stuff that happens is happening with robots. And actually, we very rarely or never have human beings inside the building. And that's going to enable us to operate them at a whole level of efficiency that we can't currently do, which I think is super exciting. So yeah, that's the transition point, I think, for data centers and where we're going to end up.
David, what a session we've had today. We've spoken about so many things, sustainable internet. Oh my God, we've spoken about machine learning, the Atlas Edge approach to getting early talent into your organization, the diversity and mix of thinking at your senior leadership, and actually a thoroughly enjoyable session talking about all those things. Maybe we need another session for single malt whiskey. Who knows?
I'm sure we'll find an opportunity for that. I don't know that this podcast will be quite as good post a bottle of single malt whiskey, but you never know.
We'll let the listeners decide on that front. But David, thank you for joining me today. A really exciting and fruitful future ahead. I'm really looking forward to it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mark.